Welcome to the Genealogy Gems podcast. It's a show filled with family history research strategies and techniques, news and entertainment, and inspiration. And I'm your host, Louise Cooke.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Genealogy Gems podcast, episode 215. This is Sunny Morton, contributing editor here at the show, filling in for host and producer Lisa Louise Cooke. Lisa has been on the road for a couple of weeks now, first to RootsTech in Salt Lake City, and now at the Australasian Congress on Genealogy and Heraldry in Sydney, Australia. Before she comes home, she and her husband Bill are having a much-deserved vacation down under, and we, her team at home, are pitching in to bring you this episode because we all know that the show must go on. I was with our Genealogy Gems team at RootsTech this year again with Lisa. It seemed even bigger and better this year than previous years, and I wasn't sure how that was possible. The enormous Salt Palace was bursting at the seams with thousands of genealogy lovers from around the world. We met so many of you and gave presentations and interviewed lots of experts and industry representatives. The Genealogy Gems booth in the exhibit hall was hopping all week with fantastic expert speakers. We captured a lot of this on camera, or at least on audio, and will gradually be sharing it in the podcast and on our YouTube channel. If you're not already getting Lisa's newsletter or subscribe to her YouTube channel, see the show notes for this episode for how to do that so that you can keep up. For today's show, we've reached back into the podcast archives to grab something special we've been holding on to. We are gradually remastering the most fun and timeless gems from Lisa's very earliest podcast episodes, which aren't already online, the very early ones, for technical reasons, and integrating them into the current episodes every now and again. Like when Lisa goes on vacation, it's a good time to bring one of those out. In this Blast from the Past episode, Lisa shares her family history connection to silent films. She'll be joined by Sam Gill, a film historian and archivist at the Niles Essanay Silent Film Museum in Fremont, California. I'll just tell you, I loved listening to the two of them geek out. It's so fun when two people are equally passionate about a topic, and especially if it's a topic that not many people know about, so they probably never get to talk about it with anyone else. They just opened up the floodgates of their arcane expertise and enthusiasm, and it all comes out. Then at the end, Lisa pulls that knowledge back into her family history research, and you can see exactly how she applies it to better understanding the past. Today's show also brings you a new mailbox story on finding a birth mother's life story, neatly summarized in an unusual record type. But first, here's your DNA Guide Diahan Southard with some DNA news from RootsTech 2018.
When I was at summer camp, we used to sing a little ditty anytime somebody said the word announcements. It went like this. Announcements, announcements, announcements. A terrible death to die, a terrible death to die, a terrible death to be talked to death, a terrible death to die. Announcements, announcements, announcements. Well, there were plenty of announcements over the course of the RootsTech week, especially if you are interested in DNA, which, of course, you are. But if you're tempted to keel over, it might be due to shock and excitement and not boredom. First up was MyHeritage, showing their support for the 7 million adopted individuals in the United States with their new DNA Quest campaign. MyHeritage will provide 15,000 DNA test kits to eligible participants free of charge in order to help these adoptees use DNA to reunite them with their biological families. With this initiative, they, quote, hope to make this project a shining light for corporate philanthropy and an example to be followed by other commercial companies in their own lines of expertise to make the world a better place, end quote. MyHeritage has assembled an advisory board of genetic genealogists and genetic counselors to help drive this project and ensure it meets the needs of the community. If you or someone you know is interested in participating, you can head on over to the DNA Quest website at www.dnaquest.com to fill out an application. But you better hurry. The application deadline is April 30th, 2018. Next, addressing the biggest problem in genetic genealogy, namely the looming "what next" question facing millions of newly swabbed participants, MyHeritage announced the Big Tree, a giant network of genetic and genealogy results that will automate much of the match comparison and tree searching to replace your head-scratching with light bulb moments. They've already made significant headway on this project, as reported in the journal Science, that MyHeritage's own Chief Scientific Officer, Yaniv Erlich, collaborated on. The journal reports that the team of scientists successfully extracted public family trees from Genie.com, a MyHeritage daughter company, and then used a computer program to clean up and link the trees together. It sounds like MyHeritage will be adding genetic data to this kind of tree in their Big Tree project. MyHeritage isn't the only company out to improve the DNA matching experience. UK-based Living DNA announced that they plan to add DNA matching to their popular Origins test by the third quarter 2018. When they launched in October of 2016, Living DNA was not offering cousin matching, but opted instead to focus all of their resources on providing very detailed Origins reports, including breaking down the UK into 46 categories. In the months since their launch, they've been working on a genetic matching system called Family Networks that will appeal to a wide range of users and will, quote, reduce the risk of human error and take away the tedious task of figuring out how each person on a user's list are related to one another. End quote. They are promising an experience that provides, quote, a level of relationship prediction and specificity beyond anything currently on the market. End quote. So, it sounds like if you're currently struggling with turning your DNA matches into genealogical discoveries, our testing companies want you to know you are not alone and they are working hard to provide solutions to these problems. Time will only tell if they can succeed. Also, I want to follow up on the news I shared recently about MyHeritage DNA's update to its matching algorithm and its new chromosome browser. A couple of you gems asked questions about it on my blog post, and I thought I would read them here along with my answers in case you have the same questions. Marty asked, if I have already tested with Family Tree DNA, the Family Finder test, and uploaded my results into MyHeritage, should I take the test again with the MyHeritage company? For Marty and the rest of you, while your results with MyHeritage should be the same, regardless of whether you upload or test with them, I think there's still value in actually physically taking the DNA test. This is for two reasons. First, you get your physical DNA stored in more than one place. We certainly don't know what the future will bring, and if one company develops a cool new test that requires retesting your DNA, it will be ready and waiting. 2, transferring from Family Tree DNA to MyHeritage doesn't actually pose as much of a problem as transferring from Ancestry to MyHeritage. Because Ancestry uses a different set of DNA markers, MyHeritage and Family Tree DNA, when you transfer there from Ancestry, has to use math to fill in the gaps. While this process, called imputation, has proven to be effective, it is still math and not biology that's doing the matching. My next question was from Karen. She says, I have a question. I uploaded my data and my parents to the MyHeritage DNA site. The results were fairly similar to two other sites I've used, Ancestry and Family Tree DNA, except for the last little piece, which came back as Nigeria for all three of us. We've not had this on any other site, and both haplogroups started in ancient European origins. So my question is, does this have more to do with algorithms, or is this a default? Karen, you are right in that each company has their own reference populations and statistics so that you get different results from different places. It could be that the individuals representing Nigeria in the MyHeritage database fit more closely with your DNA than to those in the Ancestry database. Family Tree DNA does not have a Nigeria category, but only broad African categories. In the end, it's impossible to know if one is more correct than the others. You may try uploading your DNA into GEDmatch and using their array of admixture tools to get more opinions. They do have specifically African indexes that might be especially useful. If any of you have any questions for me, Diahan Southard, your DNA guide, feel free to reach out to me directly at my email address, guide@yourdnaguide.com, or you can leave a comment in any of my blog posts on the Genealogy Gems blog. Until next time, I'm Diahan Southard, your DNA guide.
You've probably found wonderful old photos and documents in your research, but that's not exactly exciting stuff to your kids and your grandkids. The truth is, the non-genealogists in our families aren't captivated by the same things we are, but you can change all that with Animoto.com. Start creating fabulous videos about your family history that they won't be able to resist. And you don't have to have any special skills. With Animoto, you drag and drop your files in, like photos and even video clips. Pick from their professional styles and huge music catalog, and voila, you've got an awesome video. I've made dozens of these, and my family loves them. Hey, my grandson didn't mention the Legos that I gave him for his birthday, but he did thank me for the video that I made. You've got to try this out for yourself. Visit Animoto.com. As I travel the world talking about genealogy, folks are always stopping me and asking for my advice on organizing and securing their family history research. And my standard answer is plant your family tree in your own backyard and share branches online. Planting your tree in your own backyard, it means keeping one master family tree in a software file right there on your own computer. That gives you ownership, control of privacy and security, and one central place to organize everything that you learn about your family. And of course, my software of choice and the one that I use is RootsMagic. I find that its tree building tools are second to none. And with RootsMagic Web Hints, you can see what record hints are available on Family Search, Find My Past, and MyHeritage. And now you have the ability to synchronize your RootsMagic database with your Ancestry tree and get those Ancestry.com web hints right there inside of RootsMagic. These are features that are really critical and they're exclusive to RootsMagic. So plant your tree today in RootsMagic and watch it grow. Get started at RootsMagic.com.
Time now to turn to the mailbox.
A longtime listener named Tom has been in touch periodically about his adventures in genealogy and his questions. He wrote in a while back asking about finding passport applications specifically for the 1930s. Now, we've covered passport applications on the show before, but the big databases you'll find on the genealogy giants Ancestry.com and FamilySearch.org, those databases only go through 1925. So we directed Tom to the U.S. State Department webpage for ordering copies of passport records issued after 1925. To do this, you need to make a Freedom of Information request. I'll put instructions on how to do that in the show notes just as a reminder for you. But recently we heard again from Tom with an update and some fascinating discoveries about this relative he was looking for. Here's what he has to say. Finally got copies of the passport application request I made to the Department of State in April of 2016. Took all this time plus a nudge from my congressional office to make it happen. My wife's mother, Bonnie Jean Head, was adopted into the Frank Matthews family in 1927, when Bonnie was about 19 months old. We have the court adoption papers from the White Pine County Superior Court issued in 1927. The court documents included an affidavit signed by Kathleen Head, affirming she was the biological mother and that she relinquished any and all parental rights to Bonnie Jean, and that the father was unknown. Doing an Ancestry.com search on Kathleen Head, that's our biological mother, resulted in many documents, including ship manifests, that seemed to show Kathleen, who never married, and her roommate, who never married, were crew members on a number of ocean liners in the early 1930s. Wow. They also traveled together to South America, and we found their passport photos from before the 1930s on Ancestry.com. I sent an FOIA, that's Freedom of Information, request to the Department of State for copies of their original passport applications according to the State Department's online instructions. I had their passport numbers from Ancestry.com. That was in April 2016. Hearing nothing by September-ish, I stopped into my congressional representative's local office and asked them if they may have a better contact source than was posted on the website. They, in turn, sent an official congressional inquiry to the State Department, which resulted in a contact from them and a note saying they had boxes of applications to search, which might take up to 6 weeks. 12 months later, October 2017, I got the copies of Kathleen Head's passport applications. The results were very informative and included physical, mental, and family information, as well as a current photo. She was a single, white woman, about 41 years old, traveling from Yokohama, Japan, to the U.S. on a Japanese-flagged ocean liner in 1935. Brave or very lucky woman at the time, just before Japan's invasion of China and the start of World War II. She died at age 83 in Long Beach, California. She and her roommate of 40-plus years were school teachers in the Long Beach area. Wow, what a life story unfolds in these passport applications. You know, it's so fascinating to me what different record types reveal for different people. So many of our ancestors never had passports and so never appear in records like these. But then you come along and find somebody who does with astounding details like these. First of all, kudos to Tom for his persistent research. I'm sorry to hear he had to wait so long and get his congressional office involved, but that was a good idea. Clearly it worked. I've made a mental note to myself in case I ever need to do the same. We've put a PDF copy of Kathleen's passport applications and the renewal from the State Department in the show notes, a link to the PDF copy that Tom sent us. I was interested to see that the documents include an affidavit of her birth information. Not a birth certificate, but an affidavit. It's kind of a delayed birth record. This kind of thing is really common to find in documentation of the 1930s. This is the time period that a lot of government paperwork, including another type of document, the Social Security applications, began requiring evidence of someone's birth information. But for this time period, a lot of people who were living didn't have official birth records because they'd never been created. This is sort of a transitional time in the record-keeping history of the United States. So the birth affidavit for Kathleen has a couple of additional clues about her family. For example, it was signed by a cousin who provided her own name and address. So these documents, you never know what you're going to find, clearly. And this was one particular one that even revealed more than the passport applications themselves had. So I have a sweet PS to add here. I happened to be involved in Lisa's ongoing email communication with Tom. In one email that he sent that came specifically to me, he sent us both a very sweet note. He said, "I think you and Lisa and all the wonderful people on Genealogy Gems are like sisters. You have all been nothing short of remarkable in helping me with finding my ancestors." That's really sweet. Thank you, Tom. Tom's pretty remarkable as well. He shared a lot of genealogy discoveries with us along the way and really inspiring stuff. And most recently, you might recognize his name because he allowed Lisa to turn his Where I'm From poem that he wrote into a short video, which is really cool. Just in case you haven't seen it yet, I'll put a link to that in the show notes.
Okay, have you visited backblaze.com/Lisa yet? If you don't have cloud backup for your computer yet, everything on it is vulnerable to loss. Your pictures, your master genealogy database, files for work, the everyday business of your household. Losing all of that at once is as devastating as it sounds. That's why I did my homework and I found a cloud-based backup service provider. I chose Backblaze. It runs in the background 24/7, automatically saving copies of everything, including my precious video files. Did you know that some of the other leading services actually skip your video files when they do the backup? Hello, not good. And Backblaze is so easy to use. I love their free app that allows me to access all my files if I need to from my smartphone or my tablet. Most importantly, the service is totally affordable for real people. It's just $5 a month. So don't wait to ensure that all your files are safe. Do it now. Back them up like I do with Backblaze. Head over to backblaze.com/Lisa and get that $5 a month deal. Check it out for yourself. You could even do a free trial. That's backblaze.com/Lisa. MyHeritage.com is your home for global genealogy research. The site boasts the most geographically diverse membership in the world, with a strong presence in many European countries. Search for cousin connections worldwide among more than 86 million people on a site that operates in over 40 languages. Powerful proprietary search technologies at MyHeritage.com dig deeper and with greater accuracy into billions of historical records and online trees. This is the only major genealogy website that offers automated hinting on possible matches in digitized historical newspapers. And now, MyHeritage offers autosomal DNA testing too. They're jumpstarting their DNA database by inviting members to upload their own and by sponsoring tests in certain parts of the world. I'm looking forward to the geographical diversity I anticipate from their DNA data. So head on over to myheritage.com and expand your global genealogy research. That's myheritage.com. In episode 2 of the Genealogy Gems podcast, I talked about transcription of family journals and letters. As I mentioned, over the last few years, I've been transcribing all of my grandmother's diaries from the 1920s and the 1930s. Well, one thing I quickly learned about my grandmother was what a fan of the movies that she was. And actually, she referred to them as the picture shows. In the show notes for this episode, you'll see a page from Grandma's journal. I found pages like this at the end of every diary where she was meticulously documenting the movies that she'd seen that year and the stars who had performed in them. While I love movies, especially from the 1930s and the 1940s, I don't think I'd ever watched a silent movie. I'd seen short clips on television, but never really sat down to watch one. So it occurred to me that I could better understand the times that Grandma grew up in and, the cultural influences that she was experiencing by actually watching a few. Yeah, I know silent movies are not primary sources. I'm not saying that. Don't worry, I don't enter them into my database as facts. However, I have found them to be fascinating time capsules of an era that's long gone by. And with Ancestry now releasing some of the military newsreels, knowing that they're propaganda, obviously they have a slant to them, but they are a fantastic way of seeing in motion what was going on at that time frame. You and I know that even a photograph can be misleading, but you wouldn't pass up a good photograph of your great-grandparents' hometown or their friends or places where they spent time, would you? The silent movies really are these kinds of photos, but come to life. The people who performed in them were viewed intently by your ancestors. They took in their hairstyles, their decorating, their morality, all that kind of thing. And I can't pass that up. And in my case, I really couldn't because Grandma obviously thought that they were important enough to catalog. So in order to understand what was important to her, I really needed to see it for myself. So I started, where else? On the internet. In Google.com, I typed in the search box the words silent movies. Wow, there is a whole nother universe out there of folks who love and follow silent movies. Well, I kept altering my search criteria until I honed in on movie theaters that currently show silent movies in my area. My first real find was the Stanford Theater in Palo Alto, California. It was first opened in 1925 and was Palo Alto's premier movie house for several decades. In 1987, the David and Lucille Packard Foundation bought the theater and they restored it to its original splendor. And it's now owned and operated by the nonprofit Stanford Theater Foundation. And the website provides all the movie schedules from 1929 to 1961 compiled from ads that appeared in the Palo Alto Times. And as you look through the schedules, you notice that the movies were not the only attraction. Vaudeville acts were regularly included in the entertainment lineup. Now here's an entry from my grandma's diary, dated Sunday, April 22nd, 1928. I have to lead the singing at church. Walter and I went to the lake, met Helen Weathers and Jessie J. and Ed Taylor. Helen and I went swimming. Went to the show afterwards. The vaudeville was keen. The picture was Lou Cody in Adam and Evil. A quick check in the Internet Movie Database, which you can find at imbd.com, told me all about this comedy that she mentions called Adam and Evil, and it's about identical twins, one good and one evil. And of course, they had the great Wurlitzer organ live accompaniment, which was a staple of the silent movie era. I can just imagine the excitement my grandmother felt as the mighty musical giant slowly raised from beneath the stage, magically signaling the start of a night's entertainment. Well, I saw my first silent movie at the Stanford Theater, and the movie was called Diary of a Lost Girl. It was a German movie starring Louise Brooks. It was a late entry into silent movies. It was released on April 24th, 1930, just at the beginning of the talkies. The plot consisted of an innocent young girl being attacked by the clerk of her father's pharmacy, and she became pregnant and she is rejected by her family, only to have to fend for herself in the cruel world. Well, it was not exactly the kind of wholesome fare that I expected, but it was absolutely riveting nonetheless. And I really must acknowledge the organ accompaniment on the mighty Wurlitzer of Dennis James, who played that night, because he added a drama and a magic to the movies that was really priceless. So my next movie was the classic 1923 comedy Safety Last. It was starring Harold Lloyd. If you can only see one or two silent movies, this is really a must-see. Harold Lloyd was the quintessential everyman's man, and I really enjoy his movies because they are packed full of really funny situations that could supposedly happen to anybody. My entire family went that night, and the place was sold out, and the audience just became one big family as it was roaring with laughter together. It was really cool. One big family. I was starting to get a feel after seeing that movie for what drew my grandma as a young girl to the pictures. It was magical, it was glamorous, and for a few hours, she was part of a movie-going family. In fact, as I was combing through newspapers for her hometown in the 1920s, I came across two newspaper articles. One was entitled Getting Back to the Home from January of 1925, and the other was entitled Harking Back to Those Old Home Days. It was from February 5th, 1925. The first article starts out saying, much has been said as to the methods of checking the crime and rebelliousness amongst the young people of today. The automobile, trains, and other means of travel, as well as moving pictures, dance halls, etc., that attract young people and so lead them to seek amusement away from home, have contributed to the fact that the home is not the center of attraction for the majority of families as it once was. The article went on to say that there were plans in the works for a community get-together, kind of an old-fashioned community get-together. The February 5th article reported the events of that evening, which were called Back to the Home, and the local residents ate pumpkin pie, they sang songs, they listened to speeches and music and comic readings. And just my luck, I actually recognized the name of the cellist in the orchestra, as being the man who had signed as a witness on my great-grandfather's naturalization papers, which was really cool. Anyway, the affair was a huge success, and it was deemed something that will surely bear repeating. Well, immediately, my grandmother's diary entry bemoaning her mother, who was from the old country, really started to become clearer. Grandma felt that great-grandma just didn't understand her. Not exactly new stuff for a teenager, right? But having experienced the thrill, myself, of the old movie theater experience, and now reading in the newspapers the effects on society at that time, I really began to better understand that what she was talking about more than just being 15 years old. As a mother, I began to sympathize with my great-grandmother's plight of trying to raise 3 teenagers in the new world. Now, I'm really lucky because I live about a half an hour away from a little town here in California that has a silent film museum. And it's devoted to the Essanay company, which produced, I think, about over 400 silent movies in the area back in the teens. As far as I know, they are the only theater in the country that shows silent movies every Saturday night with the live accompaniment. They show 2 short films and then 1 full-length feature film each week, and they always have live piano, and sometimes they even add a clarinet or sometimes other instruments. It's really a kick. Now, I recently spoke with the Niles Essanay Silent Film Museum's archivist, Mr. Sam Gill. Sam was an archivist for the Academy of Motion Pictures Arts and Sciences for 25 years before he retired and came up here to help out the museum. Here's my interview with him. Well, I'm here talking with Sam Gill at the Niles Essanay Museum. Is that the right
Niles
name?
Essanay Silent Film Museum.
Silent Film Museum.
Full title.
Great. And maybe you could just tell us a brief little bit about your background, just kind of how and in what capacity you're involved in silent movies.
Okay. Well, from birth, I think somehow I was officially interested in silent films from my earliest memory. That was growing up in Kansas, in a little town called Sterling, Kansas. And I was very interested in film, and as a little kid was kind of wanted to see all I could, whether they were photographs or the actual movies themselves or on TV or whatever. So anyway, I grew up with that interest and then became increasingly interested in the silent film, and I felt like maybe it hadn't been fully researched the way that later movies had. So I began to go to Los Angeles in the summers of 1966. I started that, and I would make appointments to visit some of the early silent film people, both in front of the camera and behind the camera, and get their stories and talk with them. And then eventually that led to work at the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, where I worked for 25 years as an archivist.
Oh, wow.
And then retired there and worked in different other capacities, and then moved up to Niles just a couple of years ago to help with the Niles Essanay Silent Film Museum and its work in bringing the silent films back to life again in an actual auditorium setting with people there, which we're gathering together right now as we speak.
Right. And am I mistaken in that it seemed to me, just from some internet research, that this may be the only location in the United States that provides silent movies with live accompaniment every single week.
Well,
do you know if that's the case?
I'm wondering about that too. I used to go to the silent movie theater in Hollywood, and those were silent films 5 nights a week with sound accompaniment. They use records. And there have been other attempts, I think, but I'm not aware right now of any films that are silent films shown regularly, on every Saturday night, as we're doing, in a theater that was originally a 1913 Nickelodeon era theater. Exactly. In other words, it only served as a Nickelodeon theater because by 1923 they had built a theater next door and they closed this up and it wasn't used as a theater anymore. So I thought, well, we reopened it to show silent films. So I don't think there's anything else like that, not showing on a regular basis. Of course, the San Francisco Silent Film Festival is held every year in San Francisco, and that's fantastic. And they're very supportive of what we're doing, too.
Oh, that's great. I think I told you a little bit before when we talked that the reason I had gotten involved in silent movies and my interest in them is because my grandmother, back in the 1920s, kept a regular diary every year, and she was meticulous about chronicling every single movie she ever saw, who the stars were, and as I was transcribing her journals, I started to become very familiar with these names that kept coming up, Colleen Moore and Douglas Fairbanks and Harold Lloyd, and so that's what kind of prompted me to come and check out the silent films here. And what really struck me was that there is this wealth of material that your average person almost never sees in terms of the hundreds of movies that they produced in those early years in the teens and the 20s. And even more importantly, as a genealogist, was I felt like I was looking at old photographs all of a sudden coming to life. That's one of my favorite parts of family history, is when I can get my hands on an actual photograph of a home or a person or the car they were driving. So I'm kind of curious. I know you've done a little bit of family history research in yourself. Yeah. As an archivist, do you look at the background? I mean, like when you're trying to date movies and you're looking at, what model car is that? Or are you as entranced with the background of the movie as well as the story like I am in terms of just the historical value of it?
I think you have to be, particularly in research, you have to use everything at your disposal. I'm sure that's true for genealogy. In film history research, you absolutely have to use everything. Every photo you can get a hold of, film. A lot of archives have films that they don't know what it is because by now they're unidentified footage. So sometimes they'll call upon experts in the field to look at the films or send them frame enlargements, where we can look at the frames and make some determinations by identifying either the people or the location. Sometimes the areas are noticeable, or the theme. If it's a World War I theme, there's been a book that, many years ago that was published about just World War I era movies, or there are other books on specific subjects, if it's a Western or a comedy or a drama or whatever. And you're right about the photographs. As I mentioned, when I was a child, the first thing I saw really were the photographs, and that intrigued me. And somehow I would kind of imagine in my mind them coming alive. So actually seeing the film is a great blessing. And there are literally thousands of films that have survived, but many, many more thousands that don't. But you're right, you use everything you can. There was one scholar, Bo Berglund, who realized that people should be paying more attention to the license plates because it would sometimes either have the state on there or the date or the year.
Oh, right.
So you could see it's 1920, so at least it would have to be, up to 1920 or later. They could use an old plate, but it couldn't be earlier because there would be no point to put a 1920 plate in a 1916 movie. Mm-hmm. So things like that people began to point that out. Sometimes certain landmarks are missing. In other words, something that was famous but now is gone in a film. So, you would realize, well, that had to have been made prior to a certain point. Right. I just had some stills that I was looking at. I recognized the St. Johns River in the background, and I thought, well, it makes sense because these films were made in South Jacksonville, Florida in 1916. And I thought, well, undoubtedly these are stills from the film, one of the films that was made in South Jacksonville, Florida. And that's another common thing that can happen. Or it'll be Innsville, which would be kind of where Sunset Boulevard goes out to the end of to the ocean, not to the end of the ocean, but to the end, and it's at the ocean. That's where Innsville was, and where Thomas Ince produced many of his westerns with, and the Indians, our Native American friends, had encampments there. And they used them in the movies for at least a while.
Oh, wow.
So you're right. And people know cars really help a lot, automobiles or other vehicles or other tools or equipment. Sometimes it's a window in the past because it's some trade that doesn't even exist anymore. Like blacksmithing, you don't see too many people can do blacksmithing. So that's fascinating to see real blacksmiths at work, something like that.
I just watched Mary Pickford in The Net Mender, which was a biograph film. I think it was like 1912 or that era. It was very early.
Mm-hmm, yes.
And I was, taken by the fact that this was her full-time job.
Yes,
sitting there mending the nets, yes. And two, it was just the interiors of the houses. And that always fascinates me, particularly because women are more challenging, I think, to find oftentimes in historical records. They weren't holding down jobs. They weren't necessarily putting their names in the tax roll. So I'm always really interested, well, what was their working environment? And that was the home oftentimes, or they were doing some kind of a labor type work from their home to earn income. Now, I know we can't talk, some movies were very fantasy and some were trying to seem very realistic to me. But what do you think we could take away from the kinds of interiors they did, and was there a jump? It looked to me Biograph is real simple, and then you get in the 20s and it gets much more complete looking.
Okay, you hit upon one of the reasons I love teens films so much. The teens movies, there was never films like it before or after, is the truth of the matter. And I think as the movies went on in the 20s especially, they became more glamorous, what I'd call glamorous, or a little further removed from the truth. There weren't so many movies, for example, made about ghetto life. I mean, it's like, who in the world wants to see a film about ghetto life? Well, a lot of the immigrants, particularly in the teens period, were learning English, for one thing, because they didn't have to know the language, and they could, from the titles, the intertitles that were in the silent films, they could begin to learn the letters and the language, for one thing, or someone sitting next to them could translate for them, and they could gradually learn the language. The American ideal, or whatever you want to call it, was something that could be striven for more and more in the teens period, and you saw that more in the 20s and 30s, I would say. But in the teens, you still had more accuracy, I think, to detail of the time period, particularly contemporaneous films. They didn't try and glamorize it so much. They just tried to capture it. And that's kind of a rare quality about those early films. And Lois Weber was a filmmaker, in fact, a woman filmmaker who very much believed that there were stories of the simple man or woman. In other words, that there were, her film The Blot, for example, is an amazing movie about how difficult it was for a young, not young, an older man, professor, to even make ends meet, to keep things together in his family. And the wife gets so stressed out about this that she even sees a turkey, being made next door, and has to battle with herself. Do I go steal the turkey or not? When you see the furnishings of their home, I'm sure it was extremely accurate down to the smallest detail, because Lois Weber believed in that. So some believed in it more than others. She was in some ways even criticized for that, not having more imagination. You know what I mean? But for us today, going to see these films, I think they're wonderful windows, as you were saying too, into that earlier time period. And
well, you're really the person then to ask. If I wanted to kind of go and search around and pick out some silent movies to look at, who do you know of, producer, director, who seemed to have an interest in the everyday man, in more of the accuracy thing? I know some were very fantasy, and then some, like you say, like Lois, were more focused on that and saw that there was a real value in it. Do you have any other recommendations that a person might want to go and check out those films?
Well, that's one reason we like what were often called programmer pictures. They were the little films that were made on a shoestring budget. Well, they had to make do with the best they could.
Right.
Now, it is true sometimes with the upper society dramas. Those were very popular in the up to World War I period. Then they evolved more into costume dramas, but the social drama or society dramas were sometimes wonderful too for seeing the upper class. And I think I mentioned to you my friend who was getting antiques for Christie's in London, said that when he would see some of these films, the sets that the upper echelon people were living with, the kinds of furnishings they had, where he says they're unheard of today. I mean, the hardest hardwoods, and whole tables made of things, or whole huge windows or mirror frames or something like that. So Lois Weber would be one. I kind of like some of the biograph films, like D.W. Griffith, in the not when he's westerns or something, but just his little drama films. Sometimes are very interesting because he would try and recreate their environments. A lot of the other filmmakers did that. Some others were not nearly so interested, like Maurice Turner was much more interested in fantasy films, in his own imagination. So you're right. I'm sorry I can't really, in a way, think of other people, but Universal, people who worked there almost always were using real settings. But unfortunately, Universal's films are somewhat hard to find.
Oh, really?
Due to big fires. They had big vault fires and exchange fires and things. So.
Well, I think of Harold Lloyd as being kind of the everyman's man.
Yes, he is.
And I just finished watching, again, Safety Last, and, he's a store clerk, and it's a lot of everyday type of settings. And I was probably more focused on looking at, my husband and I looked at each other and went, there are so many cars. And this is not long after cars came into regular use. And they were lined along the streets. And, he's going up the building and there's this huge crowd. And I'm thinking, this must have been the excitement of city life in 1920.
Well, okay, on that theme, a Will Rogers film called Don't Park There. It's funny, he had done some timely topics routines on recordings as early as 1923, where he's talking about it's not safe to walk across the street. You need a very nimble pair of legs, because of all the cars. And he that was so much on his mind, he made a movie called Don't Park There, which is just trying to find a parking space in Los Angeles, because, he's the hick going to the big city, and he just assumes that his Model T can zip right into any old spot. And then just when he tries to, another car comes in, just like today. Very quickly, the flivver. Many comedies were made on the flivver, which was kind of the colloquialism used to call cars. I don't know really quite where that came from. But flivvering, there's even a Victor Moore comedy made in Jacksonville, Florida called Flivvering. That's also on the theme of the car.
Oh, how funny.
And I think it was just last week we showed Wife in Auto Trouble, which is a guy who buys a new car and decides to take his secretary for a ride, which is not a good idea before taking his wife for a ride in the new car. And so then he gets caught up having to say, well, when she finds him, he says, well, it's your new car, because he has to get out of this trouble he's put himself in. So the theme of cars was a very popular subject. People loved their cars back then and love them now, of course.
It reminds me of not long ago you guys showed, is it A Trip Down Market Street?
Yes.
And that's a fascinating look at the chaos of the early automobile and how they dealt with them.
Yeah, that was made in 1906 in April, just a few days before the earthquake hit. And David Keene, our historian here, was able to determine the exact date the film was made. It was made by the Miles brothers, a local concern there, and they put a camera in front of the trolley and then just let it go down from about 8th Street down to the ferry building. And just as it turned around to come back, you see all the way down the street to the right and left, everyone not waiting for it. They just go right out. They walk out in front of it, or the trolley, or people turning back, looking at the camera like, oh, what's this? 1906. You have people like just walking, hardly paying any attention. You have horse-drawn vehicles of all kinds, as well as the first automobiles. So you have this almost amazing chaos. And it's like there's no one directing traffic, and there's no stoplights. There's no stopping at all. It's just everyone's going.
And if you had never seen a silent movie or anything in that first 20 years, you may have thought that was all orchestrated as just funny chaos. But that was what it was like
people are laughing. Every time we show that film, they laugh, but they're stunned. And some of our audience members have said it's the most astonishing film they've ever seen. I mean, because, it's all in real time.
Yes.
It's not edited. It's just set, and it just goes from one point to the next, and you see real people at real time. And there's something about the lack of editing sometimes that is more immediate to people like yourself and myself, who are interested in genealogy or family or whatever, is when you start cutting, close up and medium shot back, whatever, sometimes you destroy the real-time continuity of things because you've stopped your camera to move up or back. Whereas those real actuality films, what they're often called, actuality or travel films, are wonderful because you're seeing things actually as they were. And that was a term even used back then, was actualities. And so sometimes when you can get a hold of those or see those films, at Berkeley, just a few weeks ago, there was one, too, that was shot at Ealing in England on Broadway, their street. And it was shot from a double-decker bus in 65-millimeter film, which is almost twice the size of 35-millimeter, and huge format, which was later not used. But since it survived and has been copied and preserved, it was shown by Kevin Brownlow, the English film historian. So it's just amazing. And you mentioned home movies or people had shot photos of their families in home movies. There's a whole new interest in those as well. And the National Film Preservation Board is actually now giving more and more funding to archives to save their home movies. Just one example is the Japanese internment camps. A lot of the films that were shot by people with their little cameras there is like don't exist. There's nothing that comes close to that because it was kind of on the QT in a way anyway, what life was like there. So sometimes there were similar things like just recently found footage in Gallipoli, 1915, and you're seeing all these soldiers that would have all died. I mean, it's very moving to think that here you have a moment in time where you're looking at people, none of whom still live. Like in 1906, all those people running around, and even the little boys and girls are gone. And so this is a chance to look back in time and see this whole other era and everything that was going on. And you know, as of that date in April 1906, this is exactly the way people dressed and walked and interrelated, at least in that area of San Francisco.
And of course, the first thing you notice is they're all wearing hats. Not a head is uncovered. Now, I just watched Wings for the first time.
Oh, wonderful.
And to me, not being any kind of expert on World War I felt like I was probably getting one of the closest glimpses of World War I could get. What's your take on the accuracy of Wings?
Well, Price Glory, of course, had been a stage play. Wings had some people, well, John Monk Saunders knew all what he was talking about, and so that was based on a John Monk Saunders story. So he knew a lot about the relationships, what young guys went through, their girlfriends, you know, and I guess that was a very important film. And then All Quiet on the Western Front in 1930, which Louis Milestone directed, is probably the other major film that showed the war from the German perspective. And that was a shocking thing to do. And that was based on the Remarque novel. But many of the people who actually, the young actors who played those soldiers, bonded so much during the making of that film that for the rest of their lives they were close friends to each other.
Wow.
So that obviously touched upon something that was very real. And that's what Milestone wanted. He says, I want you to go through this like you're real soldiers. So I think that you're right. Wings has it, although there's a certain romantic side to it, I think there's also a side to it that was never equaled, never surpassed, certainly.
Really?
Wings. It's shown every year down at the Old Town Music Hall. They have a nice screening of the film because there's no really roadshow version of that film, you know. It was originally showed with sound effects. I don't know if you knew that.
No.
Yeah, the big first-run theaters had, like, airplane engines that were brought in so you could actually hear this transition to sound. There were some of these transition times they did things like that where they would have sound effects so that you could excite your audience with even more than just the silent film and the organ and an orchestra, but the sound of an airplane motor and rackety of the artillery and all this. So they were experimenting. Some of that had been done even earlier in other films like Birth of a Nation, but that was, The Wings was one of those notable films too, which again, you know, it'd be wonderful to recreate that if possible today.
Oh, yes. To actually, do something like that.
Wouldn't
here.
that be great?
Well, I can tell it's coming up on 7:30, and I can hear the crowd is starting to rustle around.
We're wrestling.
I want to thank you so much for
thank
talking
you.
to my podcast listeners. I know they'll be fascinated by what you have to say. And any last words on how to inspire these folks to take that leap and watch their first silent movie?
Oh, yeah. Come to our theater. Every
sales
Saturday. See, sales pitch for the Niles Edison Theater. We're located at, in Niles here, 37417 Niles Boulevard. And we'd love to see you here. And the nice thing about this is with the music, too, you get more of the actual experience of what it was like to walk back to the theater at that time with the musician and seeing the film projected by our own David Keene. And there it goes.
Thank you, Sam.
Okay. Thank you.
Sam is just the dearest man you'd ever want to meet. It's wonderful to hear him on Saturday nights as he introduces the films shown at the Niles Essanay Edison Theater and shares his wealth of knowledge about the background of each film and all the stars. Now, did the mention of the silent movie A Trip Down Market Street ring a bell? In episode 8 of the Genealogy Gems podcast, I covered the San Francisco earthquake and other historical events and included a YouTube.com playlist of old and new videos about the earthquake. Well, one of the videos on YouTube is an abbreviated version of the original film that we saw at Niles. And Sam told me that the reason the movie survived is that the filmmaker shipped the film to their New York offices for processing just one day before the earthquake hit.
It's Sunny again. Guessing you may now be as curious as I've become about watching an old silent film or two. But what if you don't live within driving distance of a great old theater or a museum that shows silent movies? In the original episode, Lisa offered several options, but at the time, Netflix was still so new that you had to mail movies back and forth to watch them, and Lisa wasn't totally sold on that concept. Now, of course, Netflix and other online streaming video options make it so much easier to find and watch silent films from your own device. If you're looking for a specific movie, start with a Google search with the name in quotations. And if you like anything else you know about it, such as an actor's name or a director's name or the year. You may find lots of results, including Wikipedia pages about the film or film history write-ups. But if you want a direct link to watch it, try first limiting your search results to video. You can also go to free collections that already appear together online of old silent films. I've put some links to several options in the show notes, including playlists on YouTube and the Internet Archive. What about that subscription service, Netflix.com? Netflix subscribers are used to just seeing a few main categories of movies on your opening page, but you can actually use a link that goes directly to the Netflix category page for silent films. They actually do have a lot of them. The link is in the show notes, www.netflix.com/browse/genre/53310. I'm giving you the full link here because this is a trick you can use to explore any of the great categories Netflix uses. You just enter that same link, netflix.com/browse/genre, and then another / and the code for that particular category. In the show notes, you'll find a link to a list of Netflix categories and their corresponding codes. On YouTube, you can search for silent films with the same strategies you use for Google searching. You might find a preview of the film or even the ability to watch the entire thing for free. YouTube also does have some available films to rent or buy. If that's the case, you'll see a blue clickable box in the search results saying watch from $3.99 or something like that. The show notes include more ideas for finding silent films online, including Turner Classic Movies, Amazon.com, eBay, and your local public library. The show notes also link to previews or full versions of just about every silent film Lisa or Sam mentioned. And of course, we found those links using the same tips I just gave you. Those tips are all of the type you'll find in Lisa Louise Cooke's book, The Genealogist's Google Toolbox, which really is a must-use Bible of Google searching strategies. But now, let's bring this silent film coverage full circle by returning to Lisa and her grandma's diary.
If you look again at the page from my grandma's diary, you're going to notice the entry that she wrote down for a movie called 4 Sons. In her diary, dated November 2nd, 1930, she writes, Alfred, Len, Mama, and I went to the show in Merced. 4 Sons. It was sure good. I looked the movie up in the imdb.com database, and the description stated that the movie revolved around a mother and her 4 grown sons living happily in a German village prior to World War I. Now, the oldest son, Joseph, yearns to go to America, and his mother gives him her life savings to realize his dream. After the war begins, 2 of the sons go off to battle, and they're killed. Meanwhile, Joseph becomes an American citizen and he joins the army to fight against Germany. The youngest son then leaves to join his battalion, and he's killed in battle.
In our lives, particularly the women, a feeling that continues to grow as we learn more about each ancestor's lives and find to our delight and our surprise, and probably occasionally to our consternation, the many qualities and interests we share with them. Extra credit for this episode goes to the production team who filled in for host and producer Lisa Louise Cooke. I am Genealogy Gems contributing editor Sunny Morton, and I enjoyed helping host and do some sound editing for this show. Your DNA Guide Diahan Southard also contributed content. Hannah Fullerton stepped up from her usual important role as audio editor to compile and publish what you're hearing now. Next month, we'll all be happy to welcome Lisa back to the microphone and to her role as producer. Learn more about us at www.genealogygems.com. Thanks for listening, friends. We'll talk to you soon.